Hello everyone, my name is Nekme Obasogie. This is actually my first history program since I published my book. I'm here to discuss about the Benin artifacts and the British Museum. We have three themes to explore today: restitution, decolonization, and reparation. How can we apply these three themes to the current situation of the British Museum? Looking at the dark history of the pacification of territories in West Africa by the Europeans during the colonial era in the 19th century, how the Benin artifacts were looted from the Oba Palace by the British expeditionary officers during the punitive expedition of 1897 in Benin. Some British writers of the 21st century have done an anonymous research on how these artifacts were disseminated across the globe. Some Benin artifacts are under the possession of private collectors, private markets, museums across the globe, institutions, you name it. According to a British writer, Barnaby Phillips, one single Benin artifact was sold for £10 million in Europe in 2016. Before we dive into the main analysis of today, let's look at some of the countries that received Benin artifacts after they were looted in 1897.
The British government, which was concerned with neither romance nor scholarship, put the loot on sale in order to defray the cost of the expedition to the taxpayer. And today, the treasure of Benin is dispersed among museums and collections all over the world, in Britain and America, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, Sweden, France, and Australia. The second biggest collection is now back in Nigeria, but none of the objects have returned to the place from which they were taken, the palace of the Oba of Benin.
Out of the picture here, Kenneth Murray, founder of Nigeria's museums, and a man who in the 1940s and 50s works incredibly hard to bring back some of the finest Benin bronzes to Nigeria. He buys what is considered, I believe, by some people as the finest pair of brass leopards, and what Kenneth Murray thought was the greatest carved tusk of all. All of those pieces belong to Nigeria today. Murray died, sadly, in 1972 in Nigeria, a few days after the cars had switched from driving on the left to the right-hand side. He died in a car crash.
After the looting of Benin artifacts in 1897 by the British expeditionary officers, they were scattered across the globe, while some were returned back to Nigeria in the 50s by a British man, Kenneth Murray, who later established multiple museums in Nigeria where he kept many Benin bronzes and artifacts. History has it that during the military rule in Nigeria, General Yakubu Gowon impulsively gifted one Benin artifact to the Queen of England in the 70s without the consent of the original owners of the artifact and the curator of the museum in Lagos at that time.
And I have one specifically in mind, and I want to use this platform to talk about it or mention it, and that is the bronze head that the military ruler of Nigeria, General Yakubu Gowon, in the 1970s gifted to the Queen of England. I would hope that the British government, the Queen, will return that object, because it was taken by the military head of state, the dictator, from the museum straight to England against the wishes of the curators of the National Museum. And so I would hope that that head will be returned to Nigeria sooner rather than later.
After the episode of 1897, Benin artifacts became the subjects of exploitation across the globe. Many Benin artifacts are still under the illegal possession of some Western countries as we speak. Australia is on the list of the countries that received Benin artifacts. This is a wake-up call to Australia that Benin artifacts deserve to be returned back to Benin in 21st century. Let's quickly look at what some British commentators and writers are saying about Benin artifacts. Take a look.
Professor Dan Hicks has written a book that, with all the adulations and critical receptions that it has received, it's important to highlight the fact that he is speaking from within the museum. And this is something that we have not had in the decades of debates around the fate of Benin. Speaking from the museum, arguing why the objects must be returned. What we've had over the decades is why they cannot be returned. This is why I think that Dan's book and his work towards the subject, it's really utterly fundamental.
I think some British modern thinkers or modern writers are cognizant of the injustice embedded in the looting of Benin artifacts in 1897 and the pacification of territories in West Africa during the colonial era by their predecessors. So there's a kind of a paradigm shift on how modern British writers perceive Africans compared to the British writers of the 19th century. During the peak of grabbing territories in West Africa, the Berlin Conference. We don't want to reprimand people on how Africans were depicted by some British writers in the 19th century. A credit should be given to Professor Dan Hicks and Barnaby Phillips for their immense contribution to the ongoing campaign for the restitution of Benin artifacts. Their research is helping us to connect some dots in the system. There are fallacious claims and speculations in Europe that if Benin artifacts are returned back to Nigeria, they will be subjects of war, many will be sold out, while others will be stolen.
A third thing we hear is that the bronzes are unsafe in Nigeria. But as my book underlines, they have been equally unsafe in the hands of the British, not least because of the attack of 1897 that destroyed so much of an ancient royal and sacred landscape. We only see a number of actually what was lost in terms of what's in museums now. We hear that objects would be sold off. We hear that objects, if they were returned to Nigeria, would be unsafe. They would be subject to war or to theft. Well, in fact, so many of the museums, and in a lot of ways, in the case of the second of the Pitt Rivers collections, the most important of the Benin collections made after 1897, have been sold off here in the West. They have been sold off as European museums have been shut down. And here on the right-hand side, a reminder that the Benin bronzes in Liverpool and in Hull were themselves the subject of war that led to them being either damaged or destroyed in 1941 in the Blitz.
The Europeans are responsible for the looting and selling of Benin artifacts. In 2016, few years ago, one piece of Benin artifact was sold for £10 million in Europe. Listen.
I was able to piece together the extraordinary story of this piece, the Oli head, which had sat almost forgotten in a London bank vault for more than 60 years and was sold in 2016 to an unknown buyer, as I say there, for £10 million, a world record price by far for a Benin bronze, perhaps for any piece of African art. People listening may know whether that is the case.
The idea that Benin artifacts are not safe in Nigeria is their pretext of keeping these objects in their various countries. There is no oral history or historical record connecting any group of people causing significant damages to the Benin artifacts except for the British. There is another speculation in Europe that if Benin artifacts are removed from the British Museum, the museum will be empty, probably collapse. These are some of the arguments surrounding the restitution of Benin artifacts.
And I guess the final thing to say is that returns are not about emptying museums. It isn't an attack upon museums. It isn't about the shutting down of museums because there's going to be nothing left. With the decisions made at Aberdeen and elsewhere in Cambridge and so forth, the decisions right now for the Benin case are just overwhelming. The case is so overwhelmingly there, and I think, in my view, actually very clear.
Some Western countries are responsible for the illegal possession and selling of Benin artifacts in the West. The current Oba of Benin witnessed the exhibition of some Benin artifacts in New York years ago. These artifacts were exhibited with other materials that were stolen by the Europeans in Africa during the colonial era. It will amaze you that these materials were deemed as the properties of extinct cultures in Africa. Take a look.
I'll tell you something else. When I was in New York, I was doing my master's in New York. One of my American family friends came to me and said, Your Highness, you won't believe what they are doing in New York. New York City. I was in New Jersey doing my master's. I did my postgraduate training in the United Nations in New York, at the UN headquarters in New York. So we have a little bit of experience about these things. I was told that Benin bronze and artifacts were being exhibited in New York. I think at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And you won't believe the background to all this. It was very, very interesting. That the professors at the NYU, New York University, they were exhibiting works of African arts of African people that were extinct. You know the meaning of extinct? That they were extinct. So my family, this my American family friend, said to the professor, who eventually came to Benin, that what do you mean by, that was the criteria for their doing the exhibition. So they chose Benin, that they should go and find an African society that is extinct and exhibit the exhibit their artworks. So they told the professor that you have already failed in this your exhibition if you based it on the criteria that these people don't exist anymore. They are thriving and very much alive in their country, and the culture is still very viable, very viable. They were very surprised, and that even the heir apparent to the throne is even doing his masters in New Jersey. They were shocked. Immediately they invited me to please come, declare the exhibition open. But I was not around, unfortunately for that. I was visiting my father at that time in Nigeria. They still insisted whenever I come back, they want to have me there. So I went there. When I got there, saw Benin artworks all over the place.
Imagine how African treasures are constructed in the West. The Benin Kingdom, a very vibrant and dynamic culture in West Africa, is considered as extinct culture in the West.
And will the British Museum, even on the basis of a long-term loan, give up any of its Benin bronzes collection. So this is about, I know none of us here is representing the British Museum. So I guess this is aspirational. Whatever your response is might be aspirational. So could anyone take a bite at this?
I'll take a bite because I can see my
Yes.
colleagues are not willing to. So,
from the analysis so far, it is crystal clear that the British Museum is reluctant to return Benin artifacts back to the original owners due to the ongoing neo-colonial agenda of the West in Africa. We are demanding for decolonization, restitution, and reparation. These demands are overdue.